Vamos a iniciar con el primer módulo de este seminario, que lleva por nombre, este primer módulo tratará sobre la dimensión territorial del desarrollo en el Caribe. Nuestra mesa está integrada por la secretaria permanente del Ministerio de Planificación y Desarrollo Económico de Dominica, la señora Gloria Joseph. También nos acompaña la Contralor de la División de Impuestos Internos del Ministerio de Finanzas, Planificación, Desarrollo Económico y Desarrollo de Recursos Físicos de Granada, la señora Michelle de Stephen. Y completando la mesa, la directora de programa del Instituto de Planificación de Jamaica, la señora Elizabeth Emmanuel. Este primer módulo será en inglés. Tenemos traductores disponibles. Para moderar, llamamos entonces a la señora Diana Quarles, directora de la sede subregional de la CEPAL para el Caribe.
Muchas gracias y buenos días a todos. Distinguished representatives, yes, it's good. Wonderful to be here. Thank you for having us, and thank you for my particular expression of appreciation to ILPES and CEPAL, and especially our distinguished executive secretary, who is not with us, for initiating a Caribbean first strategy, which is the reason that we are here. And it started at the Forum on Sustainable Development held in Santiago earlier this year, when following the discussion of the challenges, of the unique challenges faced by the Caribbean in their efforts to achieve sustainable development, the unique challenges that we face as small, vulnerable, middle-income developing countries. Our executive secretary decided that there should be within ECLAC that special focus on the Caribbean. We call it the Caribbean First Initiative, and this is why the Caribbean this morning is first. We're extremely pleased to be here, and our subject, planning for resilience, speaks to the heart of the challenge that the Caribbean has in pursuing its development objectives. Because the message that we want you to leave with following the collective presentations of my fellow representatives at the head table is that certainly for the Caribbean, sustainable development cannot be achieved without a concerted focus on risk reduction and building resilience. So for the Caribbean, sustainable development and resilience building are one and the same. That is the message that I will be emphasizing throughout, and I will set the stage for the discussion this morning with a brief presentation before I hand the floor over to my distinguished representatives that share the head table. I have to my left, as was introduced, the Permanent Secretary for Planning and Economic Development of Dominica. And you may or may not recall that Dominica was one of the countries devastated by Category 5 storms, hurricane last year. And therefore the Permanent Secretary's presentation will speak exactly to that challenge that we have in building resilience and in seeking to maintain development at the same time as reconstruction after such a challenge. To my right, Elizabeth Emmanuel is head of Vision 2030, the secretariat that oversees national development planning for Jamaica, one of the countries in the Caribbean that is particularly strong in its focus and its platform for sustainable development, and will give you a good sense of the challenges that the countries of the Caribbean face in pursuing effective sustainable development through resilience building. And so my outline this morning really speaks to the the question of resilience. Why planning for resilience? The very brief outline I will give you will take you through the issue of vulnerability, which is a core issue for the Caribbean, but not just vulnerability. It is the emphasis on resilience in the face of vulnerability. Because for us, we can't discuss one without the other. Vulnerability, all countries can be vulnerable. Holland is vulnerable because they're below sea level. New Orleans, following Katrina, was vulnerable. But it is their capacity to rebuild, to rebound, to recover. And that capacity comes from technological advancement, from strong policies, from resources, all of this that allows them that resilient capacity. That is what distinguishes them from the challenges that we face in the Caribbean. So we have vulnerability and we have a challenge with resilience. And this is what we want to speak to. How is it that the countries of the Caribbean will be able to pursue development through a better handle on resilience building? And this is what essentially our discussion will be this morning. So within this, and this is information that is provided by the World Risk Index, disaster risk is disproportionately concentrated in low and middle income countries, particularly small island developing states. Of the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world, 6 of them are in the Caribbean. 6 of them. And we are here this week in the Caribbean in the height of the hurricane season, after one of the most devastating seasons that we had last year. And there are many factors that impact on that vulnerability. There's the physical, there's the question of territorial inequality, and I'm going to go into these just a little bit more. Geographic dispersion, because most of our countries are in fact multi-island. It just so happens today that we have 2 countries that are single island states in the Caribbean. But I'm going to be using the Bahamas for some of my examples to give you a sense of the challenges that small multi-island states face, because we have the Bahamas, we have Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Trinidad and Tobago. These are all multi-island states, and they face real challenges with the territorial inequality and geographic dispersion, and the challenge, therefore, of countries that face fiscal constraints in providing physical and development support for many different islands equally. And of course, the whole question of climate change exacerbating the vulnerability of these states. I'm going to skip some of the vulnerability that is exacerbated by climate change. You will see that 70% of the beaches in the Caribbean are being eroded. Housing, infrastructure, we're having serious coastline loss, and at least a 1.8 millimeter increase in sea level rise, which is in fact reducing the level of land space. I'm not going to spend too much time on these. Much of this is well known. These are the number of events and the extent to which the countries of the Caribbean have been impacted by storms over the years. The damage in excess of $34 billion over the past 20 to 30 years, impacting. And note that there is a cyclical event in the impact of storms in the Caribbean. We had perhaps our worst year in 2004, but last year was equally bad. Now, some of the issues that impact our vulnerability, and we're speaking mostly of the physical and the impact that natural disasters have on the vulnerability of the Caribbean, but the resilience of the Caribbean is impacted, is undermined by the economic vulnerability of the Caribbean. And one of the key issues which ECLAC is in fact attempting to address is the question of the high debt, which severely limits the scope of the countries of the Caribbean to address social and economic indicators, poverty, building the productive capacity, investing in the productive capacity of the countries. There's also the question of the fact of being middle-income countries. Being middle-income countries, this has also undermined our ability to receive official development assistance, concessional financing. There has been a dramatic decline in both ODA and foreign direct investment. So you have the combination of a contraction of resources into the region at the same time that because of the high debt, the countries are facing severe fiscal constraints, and this has limited their ability to invest in those physical and social factors that would build the resilience of these countries. And we're speaking here now of the institutional capacity or capacity for measurement and monitoring. There is a very real challenge that the Caribbean faces in terms of numbers, and we'll see the importance of indicators for monitoring progress and being able to signal where we need to change course. These are some other factors that I had alluded to. The question of the multi-island character of the state, diseconomies of scale, because these are small islands and therefore they don't have economies of scale. Unequal access to public infrastructure, the question of poverty, of people building on risky hillsides, risky human settlements, building too close to the coastline and therefore being completely devastated by sea level rise and by storm surge, the absence of strong investment in public infrastructure, and the constant bombardment and depreciation in public infrastructure, because year after year, the structures, the roads, the bridges are impacted by these hurricanes and storms. The Minister of Planning of St. Vincent and the Grenadines speaks often of what he calls the $5 million bridge. That they call them rains. It wasn't even a named storm. It was just Christmas rains, they called it, and it washed out the bridge. And the World Bank gave them $5 million to rebuild it. And by the next year, it had been washed out again. They got another $5 million loan, and the very next year, it was washed out a third time. And in 3 years, they had a $15 million debt for a bridge they didn't have. That is the challenge that the countries of the Caribbean face. This is the damage that my colleagues will certainly speak to. I want to show you this slide, which is, as I said, I'm using the Bahamas because it is a multi-island state. It is an upper income. It is classified as an upper income country. Yet, the Bahamas has faced 28 storms in the last 28 years. They haven't been hit by a storm every year. But if you check, for example, 1999, they had 2 hurricanes and 2 storms hitting them in a single year. 28 storms in 28 years. And it's a country that is dispersed. Well, I think they have like 200 islands, but they're living on 20 of those islands. And the challenge that the government of the Bahamas has in dealing with the impact of storms that come year after year is phenomenal. So, and that's the impact of hurricane loss in the Bahamas in 2017 alone, in excess of 250 million. That's 250 million in your debt, in your budget that you did not anticipate. And this is really just to set the stage, to emphasize the importance of planning as an integral part of for the Caribbean resilience building. Planning was identified by Agenda 2030 as a critical issue, a critical and an important strategy in advancing sustainable development. And so for us, planning has to be integrated into the sustainable development process. And that means, therefore, for the Caribbean, planning has to be integrated into a resilience strategy. And so we plan for resilience when we plan for sustainable development. They are, for us, one and the same. And I'm going to take you quickly through what it means. The pillars. There are pillars of action for disaster risk management, and risk identification, risk reduction, preparedness, financial protection, resilience, and recovery. And I'm just going to very quickly identify, in terms of risk identification, that is about data. What is it? What are the threats? What is the level of exposure? We need to know how we assess the threats and the exposure that our infrastructure will face. This is linked to the disaster assessments that we, in fact, have done. We have been doing in the Caribbean for the past 4 or 5 years. The next pillar of risk reduction is the next pillar of risk management. The question of risk reduction, which has both structural and non-structural dimensions. There's a question of policy intervention. So you implement new building codes and policies, economic and social, that facilitate risk reduction. You also have technical solutions. We made a recommendation to 2 countries in 1995, following the dollar assessments that we did for St. Martin and Anguilla. And we recommended to both those countries that they don't put back up the electric poles, that electricity must be put underground. St. Martin received the support of the Dutch to implement that recommendation, that ECLAC recommendation, and they put their power lines underground. Anguilla didn't have the resources to follow through, and so they put back up the poles. As a result of that, we did the dollar assessments for both Anguilla and St. Martin last year. They were both hit by the Category 5 storms. And St. Martin was able to restore electricity to most of the country within 2 weeks because the electric lines were underground. Anguilla, 8 months. They're still, in fact, restoring electricity to some parts of the country. So you appreciate resilience. In a case like that, resilience requires, the investment in resilience requires resources. So it's one thing to have the policy, and it's another to be able to have the resources to actually implement it. Diversification is another important way of ensuring that there's risk reduction. In the case of Anguilla, 70% of their resources come from tourism. Totally decimated. They lost 70% of their GDP in a single event. Preparedness, that's the third pillar. And that speaks again to raising the level of awareness. If your population understands and appreciates the challenge that it faces, then it is going to respond in a different way. You need to make your population partners in the resilience strategy. This speaks about early warning. It speaks about education. It's one of the things that we do regularly. We conduct training exercises in the various countries to make sure that the governments as well as the communities are aware of the contribution that they can make to reducing risk and building resilience. One of the things that we noted in our assessments following the hurricanes last year was the question of school books. There were mountains and mountains of school books destroyed by water. And had the schools had a system when there is a notification of a storm, a system for protecting school books, then there would have been a way to preserve those books. And so it took longer to get school up and running again in the various countries impacted, simply because they have not engaged the communities and all the stakeholders in finding ways to build resilience. Financial protection, and this speaks to questions of insurance and resilient reconstruction, and of course I've spoken to the challenges faced by debt, ODA, FDI, and in the face of a Category 5 storm, I don't even know really what you can do to protect yourself from this. There is need for ex-ante investment planning, and there's need for a greater investment in macroeconomic capacity. The question of risk transfer, I think we'll also hear about that from Liz. And then the financial instruments. Of course, there's the Caribbean CRIF, the Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility that provides very necessary support post-disaster. There's need for government and recovery funds, increased investment in private insurance, again involving the communities. You can create homegrown microcredit schemes. And of course, we at ECLAC have advanced a debt for climate swap, a resilience fund to assist countries in building, in investing in green industries and initiatives that help to build resilience. There is the whole question of resilient recovery. This is building back better. Having faced a real challenge, how do we invest? How do we use the fact of a catastrophe to ensure that the second time it happens, we're ready for it? So these are the essential issues that we face in seeking to advance a more resilient strategy for sustainable development in the Caribbean. I am going to hand over right away to my colleague to the right, Elizabeth Emmanuel. She is the head of the Secretariat for Agenda for Vision 2030, which is the National Development Plan of Jamaica. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. Good morning, distinguished representatives. Happy to see not just our representatives from ILPES, but some of our representatives from the region that I'm from, the Caribbean. And once again, thank you for inviting Jamaica to this very important meeting. It's always very useful to hear the perspectives of colleagues and to be able to see what we can take back in our own planning processes. And over the years, I've found that very useful in terms of how we in Jamaica continuously plan as we seek to improve the sustainability and advance sustainable prosperity of that small island Caribbean state. My presentation today, and I chose not to do a PowerPoint so that you can focus on me and hear what I'm saying, would be looking at the whole notion of sustainable urban and rural development within the context of national development planning. And I will take you through how in Jamaica we are aligning our national development planning frameworks with Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, as well as share with you some of the projects that we deem to be transformational in the next 3 years. So we have a medium term. What are we going to do in the medium term, and how that links with both urban and rural development as well as disaster risk management. As Mrs. Qualis alluded to, we know that globally it is well recognized that urban and regional planning, based on the principles of sustainability, play a critical role within countries in the optimization of the use of resources at regional and global levels, and contribute to better or more sound development planning. Of course, this in turn facilitates the development of multi-sectoral and spatial linkages. It enables us to identify the growth potential of areas and the most effective means of harnessing that potential. It informs market decisions by helping to reveal trends in the economy, society, and the natural environment. So regardless of how small a country is, the notion of planning at both the urban and rural as well as regional levels is very important. For Jamaica, the very core of Jamaica's development planning is our Vision 2030 Jamaica National Development Plan, which is based on an overarching vision for Jamaica. And that vision is simple. It's really saying that we want Jamaica to be the place of choice for Jamaicans to live, work, raise families, and do their business. But cascading from that vision, what we have are 4 national goals. This is what we aspire to be by 2030. And those goals are, Jamaicans are empowered to achieve their fullest potential. And if you think about that, really, what falls under that is things like education, training, health, our population, or our authentic and transformational culture, effective social protection. Our second national goal speaks to the Jamaican society being secure, cohesive, and just. And you are here, we are all here, but we all know, for example, that in Jamaica, we do have high levels of crime and violence. So we're looking at the issue of national security, creating safer spaces and a safer Jamaica. But we're also looking at the notion of effective governance, because regardless of how much economic growth you have, how much you try to train people, how effective your institutions are, it has to be underpinned by the notion of good governance. We're looking at things from the efficiency and effectiveness in the delivery of public services, to the control of corruption, to voice and accountability, to your rule of law. Governance must play a central role in any planning process. And then thirdly, we want prosperity. Every country wants prosperity. So we're looking at our third national goal is Jamaica has a prosperous economy. And there we're looking at things like macroeconomic stability, debt and fiscal sustainability. We're looking at an enabling business environment. For example, the ease of doing business. Right? We're looking at things like our economic infrastructure, from our telecommunications to energy to water and wastewater. We're looking at innovation and creating the framework for for the application of science technology and to the movement into an innovation-driven stage of development. Of course, we have a very strong focus on renewables and renewable energy. And for many of you, you know that we have the largest wind farm in the Caribbean, for example. We have 4 phases of that wind farm. But we're also looking at improving the competitiveness of our industry structures, be it agriculture, our cultural and creative industries, our services sector, I said agriculture before, tourism sector, etc. And lastly, but by no means least, because the goals are in not any particular order, the goals are so designed that at the end of by 2030, we would have achieved a level of sustainability. Jamaica has a healthy natural environment. And under that goal, our focus is on the sustainable use and management of environmental and natural resources, hazard risk reduction and adaptation to climate change, as well as sustainable urban and rural development. So that's the heart of our National Development Plan. And of course, with any planning process, it's going to be underpinned by core guiding principles. And funnily, one of the core guiding principles of that plan, whilst there is a focus on a people-centered approach and the notion of equity, one of the core principles of that plan is sustainable urban and rural development, because we believe that this will allow us to deliver a high quality of life for all Jamaicans. But let me get to the notion of resilience. Our location, Jamaica's location, our geology, and our geography make us prone to many natural hazards. We face a range of primary natural hazard risks, not dissimilar from other countries in the region, but our risks are earthquake and tropical cyclone risk, as well as excess rainfall risks. But we also face other secondary risks from flooding and landslides, storm surge and wave impacts, and drought. These hazards, when combined with a situation of high vulnerability, because we do have rapid urbanization, we do have unplanned settlements, usually result in disasters of varying severity. In the last 15 years, tropical cyclones, hurricanes, and depressions have cost Jamaica more than $4 billion, resulting in significant impacts on our fiscal, on our economic activity, on fiscal and social infrastructure, and oftentimes, and I was happy in Diane's presentation that she brought out the notion of schools and hospitals, because oftentimes when we're looking at infrastructure, there is always a strong focus on roads and bridges, but not so often on the impact of these disasters on schools, on hospitals. I mean, even things like earthquake risk. In Jamaica, some years ago, we did an assessment of our ability to withstand earthquake risks of a certain magnitude and what infrastructure improvements were needed. And what came out of that study was that whilst we had some good hospitals and so on, an earthquake at a particular point in Kingston, we sort of use the Haiti earthquake of 2010 and the possible impact. And whilst we do have better buildings and so on compared to Haiti, we realized that if we had an earthquake at a particular point on our Palisado strip, what the impacts would have been. And one of the most significant impacts that came out was in our hospitals, where we realized things like oxygen lines, because they have been there, they have been exposed for many years, would have been impacted. So therefore, you would have a strong standing hospital with the inability to have, for example, oxygen availability. And that in itself would have presented a crisis. So much of our impacts have affected our economic activities, our infrastructure, human welfare, as well as the impact of natural resources. And for many years, I think, in doing even the dollars prior to the last recent years, the economic impact of our natural resources were not necessarily taken into account. How does the impact on a forest or a watershed affect our future vulnerability to respond to a hazard? And these are issues that I think as communities we need to strengthen. So whilst improvements in Jamaica in disaster management have led to significant reductions in mortality, our disaster risks in general have not been significantly reduced, resulting in economic losses from various events. Luckily for us, we have not been necessarily hit by any major storms, maybe since Hurricane Ivan, but we have had incidents of excess rainfall. Hurricane Ivan, Hurricane Dean, later on in 2005, but we have had significant excess rainfall, which has had significant economic impacts. But if we add to that equation the notion of climate change, what we're seeing is that climate change is adding to the already severe and steadily worsening risk exposure of countries like Jamaica. So exposed to severe hurricane hazards, as well as extreme rainfall and related floods and landslide hazards, Jamaica, like many of the other small island developing states in the region, have a relatively long coastline and a large concentration of economic activity in the coastal zone. And of course, in many of our countries, this is due primarily to the high and growing economic importance of tourism, much of which is coastal based, and the high concentration of population on the coast. 60% of Jamaica's population lives within 5 kilometers of the coast. And what that really means is that you can drive 5 kilometers and find a coastline. But importantly, 80% of our economic infrastructure is also within that 5 kilometers of the coast. So just that picture alone tells you how vulnerable we are, coupled with poor waste management practices over many years, resulting in one of our main ecosystems being severely degraded, which are our coral reefs. So the ability of our coral reefs to really literally stand up and push back a hurricane into that ocean, or to zap out, sorry, no pun intended, zap out the energy from a hurricane is severely limited. So much of that surge will come onto land. And of course, one of our other main economic drivers is agriculture. And if we do not, and I mean, yes, we have made attempts to change the type of agriculture we have, but if we continue to grow bananas and so on, we're going to continue to be vulnerable to hydrometeorological hazards. If we don't invest more, and we have made significant investments in greenhouses and hydroponics and so on, but if we do not move, and agriculture in our region is a culture. Okay, no matter what the market demands, sometimes it's very cultural. So in Jamaica, the notion of growing yams that are this big is a cultural thing. Whereas the US market, our yams are great. They taste wonderful, very different from the yams in Trinidad, for example. But the US market demands a yam that is the size of a potato, an Irish potato. And we can't wrap our heads around that to export that Irish potato. So we're growing these yams so that we can compete with other farmers and say, I have a bigger yam. And that's that's something very cultural. So today in Jamaica, whilst I'm going to present you with some best practices, we still face many challenges. And simply, we face challenges from the economic, the social, we face national security challenges, pressures on our natural environment, and the increasing impacts of globalization, global climate change. Notwithstanding all of that, we have seen many development gains in several areas in our country, certainly in the area of human capital development. Macroeconomic stability, many of our indicators are doing very well. We've had significant reductions in unemployment and youth unemployment. So for many years, we have suffered the whole notion of unattached youth. And in many meetings, we hear about, gender issues and issues related to women. Well, in Jamaica, our issues are young boys and young men. So they're unattached youth, and they're unattached. And that unattached causes them to be easily attached to the things that are not so pleasant. So they get involved in gangs and drugs, more guns than drugs, because we have more guns. So we have been able to create spaces for these unattached youth. Not perfect, because there is still a lot of crime. We have increased significantly the use of non-fossil fuel-based energy, such as alternatives and LNG. So whereas in say, let's say 2010, our main energy provider used primarily fossil fuel, we had a lot of aging power plants. We're now in the process of, we have a lot of new plants, but importantly, those new plants have been fitted to include LNG. So our main power producer is retrofitting plants to include liquid natural gas. And we also are increasing the amount of renewables in our energy mix. We're looking at 30% renewable energy generation by 2030. And we are at this time, about 12%. One of the issues with that, though, is that you would see is that once the new power plants, regardless of how much we're doing with renewables, once you have these new power plants coming in, they're sort of displacing the efforts in renewables. And then we have had key successes in industries, particularly in agriculture and tourism, and of course, infrastructural development. Notwithstanding the positives, we are seeing things like increases in crime, particularly murder. We have, in terms of GDP growth, we have low levels of growth. We are witnessing a general increase in the number of non-communicable diseases. We have, based on the last Environmental Performance Index, which is put out by Yale University, we have seen a drop in our environmental sustainability, and we have had, whilst poverty was reduced significantly in 2016, we feel from a national planning perspective that poverty remains at undesirable levels, and that rural poverty is something that we have to continue to focus on. And we recognize one of the things with Vision 2030 is that it is heavily consensus-based, and we look a lot to stakeholders. So there continues to be such consensus by our stakeholders, and we work with from youth and children in our entire planning framework, which I'll discuss a little more. We always work with youth and children, our public sector, private sector, civil society, and of course we enjoy bipartisan support. Both our major political parties express and illustrate ownership of Vision 2030 Jamaica. So there continues to be consensus by our stakeholders on the need to undertake fundamental reforms to consolidate our macroeconomic gains over the years, improve our international competitiveness, and undertake holistic development in our most volatile and at-risk communities, protect our most vulnerable groups in society, which of course will be women, at-risk youth, unattached youth, and so on, and strengthen the resilience of our built and natural environment. So I've shared with you this planning framework. Of course, if you've heard what I've said, what you would see is that much of what we're trying to do is not dissimilar. If you recall our 4 national goals, it's not dissimilar to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And simply put, our Vision 2030 Jamaica will be the axis upon which the Agenda 2030 will be implemented. And let me just say that our Vision 2030, it's in our 11th year of implementation. And like Agenda 2030, it is designed, well, for us, it's designed to put our country in a position to achieve developed country status by 2030. But let me just explain. What we want to do is to transform this middle-income developing country into one which affords our citizens a high quality of life and world-class standards in critical areas, such as education, healthcare, access to environmental goods and services. Things like clean air, clean water, sanitation services. We want to be able to effectively integrate and balance economic, social, and environmental issues that is underpinned by good governance. We recognize the notion of meeting the needs of our present citizens without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And when I say this, yes, we all remember the Brundtland Commission definition, but what does that really mean? 20 years ago, I was part of the generation that I am today. So in a future generation, assuming we all don't get NCDs, we'll be here, right? And we'll want to have the same benefits we have today, or better, 20 years from now, right? So we are all part of this future generation. And we also want to look at the whole notion of equitability, including everyone as participants and beneficiaries of development, where no one is left behind. So you see, even though our plan was promulgated in 2009, it very much reflects the sentiments of Agenda 2030. We have a little joke in Jamaica, to say that when they were planning at the UN, we sat on that committee, maybe they looked at our Vision 2030, because there's really nothing in there that we were striving for from 2009 that is different in Agenda 2030. In fact, much of the language and so on is very much the same. So this Vision 2030 Jamaica really introduces a new paradigm which since its promulgation has continued to redefine the strategic direction for Jamaica. What we really want is to get onto this path of sustainable prosperity. And to do that, we need to recognize that we need to move away from the dependence on the lower forms of capital. As many of you are aware, each country globally has about 7 forms of capital that country can utilize to create prosperity. And whether it is our human capital, our man-made capital, or cultural capital, or knowledge capital, etc. But for too long, countries in our region, and continue to do so, focuses on the lower forms of capital. And what we're looking at is to move from dependence on the lower forms of capital, like our natural capital and our man-made capital and our financial capital, to moving our country to developing and sustaining the higher forms of capital, or cultural, human, knowledge, and institutional capital stocks that would move us into the higher stages of development. But we also need those higher forms of capital will also put us in a position to add value to the lower forms of capital. Simply put, if you're looking at agriculture, we're not just looking at producing bananas, but how do we convert those bananas into value-added goods to add longevity to those bananas, be it banana chips or banana ketchup or banana jam, etc. I mean, there are so many things that we could do, okay? It's really moving us. What we're really trying to do is to get into that innovation-driven stage of development, whereby we feel that with utilizing and developing our higher forms of capital, it will enable us to create the level of prosperity that we so desire. So as I said before, much of what we're doing aligns to the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course, Vision 2030 Jamaica will be the main, is the main plan that we're using to achieve Agenda 2030. And what I'd like to say is that we have this magnificent plan, and many countries have plans, and Jamaica is not short of plans either. But one of the things we did with Vision 2030 was to focus on implementation. How do we implement this plan? And do you take the plan and say, well, okay, I'm just going to do this? No. We have a strategic approach. So we have broken up that plan, or we break up that plan into bite-sized pieces, or what we refer to as the medium term, okay? And in that medium term, what we're saying is that every 3 years, we look to see what we must do to advance a little more. And because of that, we're able to take one corrective action along the way. So whilst the plan itself doesn't change, the corrective action that we'll take can change. So in effect, the notion of our medium term allows us to embrace continuous improvement. So just, I'm going out of my time. With respect to spatial planning then, what we're doing over the next 3 years is that we are advancing our comprehensive and efficient planning system. We are looking at our frameworks for sustainability planning. So the whole notion of moving into local sustainable development plans for all our parishes. We have 14 parishes. We need to develop about 8 more plans in the medium term. We have about 6. We're looking at creating sustainable urban centers and focusing on urban renewal and urban upgrading, and also looking at creating vibrant and diversified rural areas. What we have done in our medium term this year, our medium term framework, which is to be taken to Cabinet in the next 2 weeks, is that for each of the activities that we have included, we have aligned those with the targets and indicators of the SDGs, which would allow us in our reporting process to really report on how we're doing with respect to the achievement of the SDGs. So broadly speaking, we recognize the role of urban and regional planning, and we also recognize the role of hazard risk reduction and adaptation to climate change in achieving this prosperity that we want. And before I close, I'd just like to share with you, the UN did an assessment and indicated that Jamaica's National Development Plan was 91% aligned with Agenda 2030 and concluded their rapid assessments that they did that Jamaica needed to do nothing but implement its Vision 2030 to get there. They indicated that there was one particular area of concern, two particular areas, one related to gender and the other related to the marine environment in particular, that we needed to put focus on. And today I will share with you that in creating this comprehensive and efficient planning system that we want, what we have done, what we have started, and it has started in the last year, was the development of a new national spatial plan. Prior to now, we did not have a spatial plan. What we had was a national physical development plan, which dated back to about 1979, I believe, or 1986, sorry. But this national spatial plan is very dynamic because when prepared, it will provide the spatial framework for guiding the location and regulation of orderly and sustainable development in Jamaica. It will also, and what I think is very transformational about it, it will not only focus on the optimal use of our land resources, but there's going to be a strong focus on the marine resources, and it will outline for their effective use and management, and it is also going to address the notion of climate change. So that's a core criteria within that particular plan. And one other project that I think I would like to point out before I leave is within the notion of disaster risk management. We're also focusing on developing a policy within our fiscal policy framework that would focus on resilience and looking at, within the fiscal policy framework, disaster risk management. And I believe that beyond participating in different instruments, we're looking at development of a public financial policy for natural disaster risk. So while, for example, Jamaica participates in the CRIF, which is our main ex-ante financing option, what this particular policy will do within the context of our fiscal framework will be to enable us to better improve our understanding of the fiscal risk of natural disasters and also look at a range of additional public financial management for natural disaster risk instruments, including a range of financing strategies. So we recognize we have risk transfer or risk insurance, but there are other strategies such as, for example, dedicated reserve funds and so on that we may want to employ. So as I close, what I want to say is that the importance and advantages of a sustainable pathway to development, we recognize that in Jamaica. And we want to focus, and we're focusing on a pathway that we must, for resilience building, focus on a pathway that involves the green and the blue and circular economies to enable us to get the changes we want to 2030. It is by understanding and advancing the green, blue, and circular economies that by 2030 we'll be able to eliminate poverty, we will be able to achieve high levels of economic growth, social inclusion, among others, and advance the role that we play in contributing to Agenda 2030. We feel that right now in Jamaica, we are on the pathway to development where we leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Emmanuel, for that very comprehensive presentation on the planning and development strategies being pursued in Jamaica. We're very conscious of time. I am going to invite now the Permanent Secretary for Planning and Economic Development of Dominica, one of the countries devastated by Hurricane Maria last year, to give us her presentation on economic development with resilience in Dominica.
Thank you very much, Diane. Good presentation also, Elizabeth. Good morning, everybody. Recognize the distinguished ladies and gentlemen who are here today. And thank you also to the organizers for the invitation extended that I could be here to speak to you for a few minutes on what is an important subject. One of the things that we always heard was change is constant. Now we do know, added to that, that climate change is something that happens, and maybe we can call it a constant as well. Today, coincidentally, marks the 29th anniversary of the impact of Hurricane David on Dominica in August 1979, I think it was. And so that is of significance because for us in Dominica, it was one of the most devastating impacts that we could have had on the island. Also of coincidence is a few days ago, we also recognized the impact of Tropical Storm Erica in August 2015 on the island. And also in 20 days' time, we will recognize the impact of Hurricane Maria on Dominica in September of 2017. These are significant for us as we talk on the subject of climate change and building resilience in our economies. For my presentation today, I will focus on a few areas, cognizant of the limited time that is provided. I will seek to share with you what Dominica has been through, the areas of vulnerabilities for Dominica. I will also show you some spatial maps for vulnerability, speak to the impact of the recent disasters that we face, more importantly, Hurricane Maria of 2017, and our national policy and plan for mitigation and adaptation to climate change. A little bit about Dominica. Dominica is not the Dominican Republic. It is the Commonwealth of Dominica, a republic also, but so distinguished as the Commonwealth of Dominica. It is 29 miles long, 15 miles wide at its largest. It sits comfortably between two French islands, Guadeloupe and Martinique. Therefore, we consider ourselves to be the entry point to Europe. The island is susceptible and exposed to various hazards. Dominica is vulnerable to natural hazards like hydrometeorological hazards, for example, cyclones and floods, resulting in landslides and mudslides being the most common. For some time, we thought that Dominica was resilient to flooding because of the topography of the island. We are a very mountainous island, lots of hills and valleys, and we prided in our rivers. We still do. So for us, flooding would not have been a matter of concern. However, in 2015, we realized that we were flooded, and the flooding resulted in loss of life, loss of land, loss of property, and displacement of residents. The torrential rains and high winds which accompany weather-related events have been a significant factor for us. Several tropical cyclones have affected the Commonwealth of Dominica due to both its latitude and its longitude. Dominica is located in the hurricane belt. And so, most notably, we talk of the recent two events that I mentioned a while ago. Additionally, Dominica being in the vicinity of the Caribbean tectonic plate boundaries, colliding between being pulled apart or sliding past each other, the island receives its fair share of tremors and receives damage to infrastructure, particularly in the north following the earthquake of November 2004. So we have listed so far a few of the hazards that we face, from cyclones and floods to landslides, rock slides, mudslides, to earthquakes. All right? Let's go on. Dominica's geological record indicates that the island possesses robust prehistoric volcanic records. The country has 9 active volcanoes and an active boiling lake and many sulfur springs, natural features of the island that pose hazards. Therefore, for us in Dominica, resilience must be mindful. For us in Dominica, when we talk about resilience, we must be mindful not only of weather-related events, but seismic events. And I'm going to show you a few maps here of Dominica's vulnerability. The first one refers to coastal surge hazards. It's a map that tells you that for Dominica, the green being low, that we have a low susceptibility to coastal surges, although most of our communities are on the coastal lines. The second map, a composite hazard map of Dominica, speaks to our susceptibility to earthquakes. And the red and the burgundy colors tells you that Dominica has a high level of susceptibility to earthquakes and volcanic activities in the north and in the south and southeast of the island. So a large percentage of the island, because of its small size, is susceptible to shocks from earthquakes. The next map is a volcanic hazard map. This map also shows you that the red area indicates the high level of susceptibility to volcanic activity, and that particularly being the north region where we have the second town, Portsmouth, and that is one of the development belts of Dominica, economic activity, and also the south and southeast regions, all the way to the west of Dominica. The next map shows you the earthquake hazards that Dominica is prone to. The areas in blue are the highest areas. And we do know that earthquake hazards can create surges. So the area in the north of Dominica, particularly Portsmouth and along the west coast, where we have a number of outlying communities, and the south of the island also are susceptible to earthquake hazards. I want to bring you a little bit closer home to the flood of 2015 in Dominica, Tropical Storm Erika. These hazards impacted strongly Dominica, and as you can see on the map, total buildings that were damaged as a result of flooding was 85%. Is it 85? Okay. Small moment. Yes, 88% of buildings were vulnerable to flooding. The next map that I will show you, it's telling us a little bit about the impact of floods on buildings in Dominica by communities. I won't go into the detail except to let you know that there were a number of communities impacted by the floods of 2015 and hurricane of 2017 that resulted in the need for the government to resettle entire and partial communities. Now, this is significant since it means that there would have to be a diversion of resources to be able to channel into rebuilding entire communities. And we are well on our way to do that. For example, One of our major communities that was impacted by the tropical storm Erika in 2015 in the southern part of the island, that is the community of Petit Savan, the entire community needed to be resettled. And we now have a housing program underway that would cater for a complete urban city to move these people to. 91 of these houses would be ready by the end of this month, and so 91 families would move in out of a total of 341 families to be housed. So that in effect gives you a little bit of a picture of the impact. And when we talk about resettling communities, we're not just talking about housing. We're talking of the infrastructure, all the services, all the amenities that are needed to be able to bring comfort to that community. And at the time while the communities are displaced, government must find temporary housing, create avenues for livelihood, employment, and other types of social protection interventions for the communities. The next map shows you Dominica's susceptibility to landslides and its impact on the road network. The areas in red, highlighted in red, are areas where we have a high susceptibility to landslides. And that in itself creates disturbance to the flow of traffic, to the movement of persons, as our bridges, our waterways are impacted because of the slides, and we have loss of land. So you can see that although we are a very beautiful country, we face a number of vulnerabilities. It may not be relative to your country, but it's just that the shocks come in different forms and in different degrees of intensity. For example, Hurricane Maria of 2017 was the worst that we ever faced. We thought that David of 1979 was terrible, but we realized that we were ill-prepared for a Category 5 hurricane and its devastating effect on both social and economic life of the people. So, in summation of this, I will talk about the impacts of climate change on Dominica for the last 3 years. In 2017-2018, that fiscal year, it was projected that we were on a very good trajectory of growth. We had just started rebounding from the impact of Tropical Storm Erika, and the country was predicted to have growth of 4%. But with Hurricane Maria in 2017, we had an erosion of 226% of GDP. Can you imagine what that is like? It's not just talking about climate change, it's living in the reality of the impacts of climate change. Just realizing this is enough to get your head spinning. For example, when I did some analysis, a deeper analysis from the post-disaster needs assessment, I was able to see that just the losses, the damage and losses on 2 sectors was the equivalent of the full budget for that particular year. Damage and loss to 2 sectors was the equivalent of the entire national budget for that particular year. Additionally, we realized significant increases in poverty and indigence, and therefore a heavy reliance on government for social protection. And so government has to find ways and means to insulate itself. Last evening, I went through the entire budget address in more detail of the Honorable Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit. And with the realization of the fact that a country that is so prone to disasters, so small in size, in population, so fragile in its economy, is proposing to build the first climate resilient country of the world. And one would ask, why, how, when, where, and all the other questions. But it's a fact that there are no options to us than building back with resilience. Loss of jobs and livelihood has been the impact. Damage to schools, hospitals, health centers, bridges, you name it, every sector of the economy was adversely affected by just one major weather event. Damage to agriculture was in the region of 90%. We had adverse impact to the tourism industry, damage and destruction to the private sector, both small and medium-sized enterprises, manufacturing, agro, and more recently, the departure of one of our major income boosters for Dominica, the departure of the Ross University School of Medicine, a significant contributor to the economy. So if I were to just go back to the previous slide very briefly, you would see that there is heavy reliance on government's intervention for restoring the country, for restoring the economy. Help is needed in every area, and we realize that in accordance with the Sustainable Development Goal number 17 in particular, there must be partnerships for resilience, because no one country can do this all on its own. But I'm happy to report, though, that despite the many challenges that we face, we are already on a path to sustainability and recovery. We have done quite a bit in less than 1 year. So what's remaining for us in the midst of all of this? How do we build back? The need for continued and strong visionary leadership is a must. It is nothing that you can deflect from. It is absolutely a necessity, strong and visionary leadership in the face of the challenges of climate change. An undaunted public and private sector is important. And one of the areas that sometimes we are blind to building resilience is within the public sector. I can tell you personally that my work has tripled or more with the impact of Hurricane Maria. And this is something that we need to be cognizant of in the region, that we need to retool and empower our public sector to be able to respond to the great level of work and the demand that is placed on the public service for responding when both the public sector and the private sector and the NGOs are impacted. All right? Strength and resilience of the population is what we have. Our people within the first quarter of the tropicals of the hurricane were exporting food produce back to the region because of our resilience in the area of agriculture for short-term investment. A commitment to build back better with resilience at the center, at the top, and at the bottom is something that is a must and something that we have. The message of resilience to climate change and its ill impacts has to be a message that resonates through the length and breadth of the society. And for us, a return to normalcy is what remained. We are back to normal in Dominica. Despite the fact that we are rebuilding, recovering, reconstructing, we are back to normal. Normalcy in agriculture, all our schools are operative, all our students are back at school. All service organizations have returned to activity. And even from a social level, in terms of events, we were able to, in February of this year, just a few months after hurricane, to have seen a bigger and better carnival, and plans are on for World Creole Music Festival, and you are welcome to come. All right? So Dominica, despite all what we have, we realize that we need to move ahead. So moving on very quickly. So our national resilience objectives, as articulated in our National Resilience Development Strategy, is to build food security and self-sufficiency. Like Elizabeth said, agriculture for us in the Caribbean, and not just Jamaica, is not just agriculture, it is culture. So we realize the need for improving on food security and self-sufficiency. Resilient ecosystems and sustainable natural resource is a must. Resilient infrastructure, we are already rebuilding our infrastructure. Our entire road network is restored, and we are doing interventions within our bridges system and other forms of infrastructure. Economic empowerment and innovation is a must for us. Dominica continues to be the leading country in the region for its citizenship by investment program. And this for us is a major source of cushioning the impact of tropical storms and damages that come through these events. So for us, we are able to front load our budget because of the funding that comes through the CBI program. The other areas that we are working on in our National Resilience Plan is building on sustainable human settlements. We're realizing the impact that the storm had on our housing stock. It was massive. We were able to, within months after the hurricane, to assess our full housing and building structures. The assessment, the building damage assessment, was conducted with the help of the United Nations Development Program for over 31,000 buildings on the island. And we are working assiduously to be able to restore with various housing programs and projects. And we do thank our many partners, like the government of the People's Republic of China, and also the government of India, and many other countries, including organizations like the World Bank, for coming to our aid in building sustainable human settlements. We have, in that regard, revised our building standards, and also we are revamping our legislation on construction and our building codes to ensure that we build back with resilience. For us also, adequate and sustainable social protection systems are a must, and comprehensive risk management. In the optic that you see here, one of the major undertakings that we're doing is we're dredging our rivers and our main water courses to reduce the impact of flooding, and also we are building on river defense walls, slope stabilizations, and the like. So what I have shared with you today is encapsulated in what we've just developed, the Dominica's National Development Plan for 2030. It is the National Resilient Development Strategy. The plan that we had, the strategy that we had preceding this was the Growth and Social Protection Strategy. The term of this medium-term strategy came to an end in 2018, and we have, despite all the challenges that we face, developed a strategy that is receiving good reviews from all, and we are in the process of developing the Climate Resilient National Plan. Just a couple more slides and I will exit. The National Resilience Development Strategy is a broad framework which provides a roadmap and guidelines for taking the country to where it ought to be by 2030, which makes allowances for adjustment to accommodate new realities as they emerge. And it also integrates climate resilience and disaster risk management into the National Growth and Development Planning framework to achieve desirable, equitable, efficient, and effective outcomes for Dominica, particularly being a small island developing state. We have aligned the UN Sustainable Development Goals, our low carbon resilience development strategy, and other public pronouncements of the Honorable Prime Minister and of the government policy decisions into the crafting of the National Resilience Development Strategy. And for us at the Ministry of Planning, here are some of the key things that we are doing. What is expected of us to formulate and give effect to the National Resilience Development Strategy and to undertake its review every 4 years and to contribute to the Low Carbon Resilience Development Strategy 2012 to 2020. Our responsibilities are also to plan and program social development, to mobilize and coordinate development assistance. I won't go through all the details, but as we wrap up, I wish to thank you for taking the time to listen to us, and I hope that you were able to take some points or some tips from what we're doing in Dominica to continue to build resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, PS. And I think that that was really a very revealing and telling account of the challenge of vulnerability faced by the countries of the Caribbean. But more importantly, your account assures us of the resilience of spirit of the people of Dominica, and that will to return, to rebuild, to build back better. And I'm extremely pleased to hear, I was not aware before, of your National Resilient Development Strategy. That is exactly and I'm assuming that's your sustainable development. It is the foundation for your sustainable development strategy, which speaks exactly to the need of the countries of the Caribbean, and may you also join Jamaica in leading this approach in the Caribbean. It's actually the end of the coffee break, and so we are not afforded much time for discussion. I will be guided by the management, but we are quite happy to end our presentation here. Oh, I can get 10 minutes more? Really? Oh, wonderful. Okay, so we've been granted 10 minutes for any comments or questions. We said everything, right? Very good. Well, thank you for your attention, and I invite you to take a coffee break before we go to the next panel.
No.